Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Tucked between rolling hills and hidden groves, it was the kind of place where whispers carried farther than voices, and every creak of an old wooden fence was a sentence in someone's story. Life moved slowly here, like honey sliding down a cold spoon, each hour stretching longer than it should, with nothing ever feeling urgent. Most days, the wind hummed through the valley as if remembering a song no one alive could recall. And on these quiet streets, on a winding lane shaded by willow trees and old red roofs, lived June Marlowe, a girl whose presence felt like a secret waiting to be discovered. People spoke of her in passing, as if describing a dream they'd had once but couldn't fully remember. There was nothing flashy about her, no extravagant gestures or loud laughter that drew attention. She existed in the soft pauses of conversations, in the way her footsteps made no sound on gravel, in how her eyes seemed to read things not yet said. It wasn't beauty that made people stop and turn when she passed. It was a certain quiet magic. Something woven between the lines of her face, something only seen when she wasn't looking. Some said her smile had the gentleness of rain brushing against rooftops at dawn. Others claimed her voice, rarely heard, was like the pages of a book being turned slowly, thoughtfully. She didn't belong to noise, nor did she seek the center of anything. And yet, even in a crowd, she was the kind of girl who was noticed last, but remembered first. June's hair was another story entirely. A creature of its own, it fell in straight, dark curtains that reached her waist, glistening like wet ink under sunlight. It didn't wave or curl or misbehave. It simply obeyed gravity in the most graceful way possible. Some days, it looked like black silk rippling in a breeze that wasn't there. The older women at the market would stop her mother and ask, "What do you feed that child? That hair isn't of this world." It wasn't vanity that kept it long, nor ritual, it was habit. Like the way she never wore watches because she claimed time made people forget how to feel. Or the way she always carried a pen but never a notebook, saying ideas came faster than pages could handle. Her hair simply was, and always had been. No one had ever seen it up in a bun, or braided, or hidden beneath a hat. It framed her face like velvet drapes on a forgotten painting, drawing eyes to features that were soft and curious. Brows arched just slightly, lips shaped like commas in a quiet sentence, and eyes too deep for a town this small. And wherever she went, whether to the grocer's for apples or down the path behind the school where wild berries grew, there was always a small moment when someone stared a beat too long, not quite sure why. It wasn't flirtation, or even admiration. It was wonder, as if June reminded them of something they'd lost long ago, like innocence or the sound of their mothers singing before sleep. Grace Wallace knew all this. Not in the way strangers knew it, admiring from a distance, but intimately, like a song you grew up hearing every morning. They had been best friends since the age of 7, when Grace offered June half of her sandwich on a day the lunch lady forgot her name. Since then, they'd been tied together like vines on the same tree, growing in different directions but never apart. Grace was fire where June was rain, thunder where June was stillness. She was bold, animated, and always the first to speak in any room. People liked her energy, how she filled a space with her laughter, how she clapped too loudly and winked too often. She dressed like she wanted the world to remember her, every outfit a billboard of color and noise. But beneath that firestorm was a crackling discomfort. A voice that whispered, "You're always second." She never admitted it out loud, not even to herself. Instead, she drowned the voice in distractions, in parties, in gossip, in boys who only stayed long enough to catch a glimpse of June. She told herself she didn't care. After all, June never asked for the attention. But envy doesn't knock when it enters. It slips in quietly, and makes a home in the shadows of your thoughts. Grace would catch herself staring at June sometimes, not with affection, but with a hollow ache in her chest. Like she was trying to memorize a masterpiece she could never paint. It began slowly, this turning of friendship into something less tender. A shift, invisible to others, like a glass table slowly cracking from within. Grace would make remarks wrapped in humor, like bitter pills hidden in sweet syrup. "Must be nice, never needing makeup," she'd say with a grin too tight around the edges. Or, "You know, some girls would kill for your hair. Guess you just lucked out, huh?" June, ever soft-spoken, would laugh lightly and say nothing, mistaking mockery for jest. But Grace wasn't joking, not really. Each compliment was a veiled question, each laugh a blade carried in lace. The turning point came on a Saturday, when they attended a small gathering at Melanie Hawthorne's cottage. Grace had dressed in her best, red blouse, high-waisted jeans, boots with a subtle heel. She'd even curled her hair, something she rarely did. But when they walked in, it was June who stole the breath from the room. Not because she tried, but because she didn't. A boy Grace had been messaging for weeks walked straight up to June and said, "Your hair, it's unreal." Just that. A simple sentence. June, as always, gave a shy smile, brushing it off. But Grace saw red. In that moment, something inside her snapped. Not loudly, not all at once, but like a rope stretched too thin, starting to fray at the middle. She didn't speak of it that night. She didn't argue or cry. She just watched June dance under fairy lights, her hair catching the glow like strands of midnight. And in the still of her heart, something cruel began to bloom. A single shameful thought. What would she be without it? The days that followed Melanie's cottage gathering crawled forward like reluctant seasons. Grace began to feel herself shrink in rooms where June breathed easily, her own reflection slowly becoming unfamiliar. Elmsworth was no bigger than a teacup turned sideways, and in a town so small, admiration didn't echo. It condensed, landing squarely on one person. And lately that person had been June. People weren't just noticing her, they were orbiting around her. Friends who once hung off Grace's every word now paused when June spoke, even if it was just a quiet remark about the weather, or how the wildflowers near the orchard had started blooming early this year. It wasn't just the boys, though they were the most obvious offenders. It was the way the librarian remembered June's name and not hers. The way waiters smiled longer at June without realizing they did. The way June could wear a faded t-shirt and still look like she'd walked off the cover of something important. It was maddening. Grace didn't hate June, not in the way people hate villains or liars or those who have wronged them. It was something more complex, something that curdled quietly. Like milk forgotten on a windowsill, it began to spoil beneath the surface. And every time she looked at her best friend, her hair shining like glass dipped in ink, her gaze so effortlessly sincere, Grace felt as if she were standing behind a pane of glass no one else could see. Outside she smiled. She laughed when June laughed, leaned her head against hers in pictures, and said all the right things. But inside, her thoughts tangled like thorns in a forgotten garden. It wasn't fair, she began to think. Life had handed June a crown she didn't even know she was wearing, and Grace, oh Grace, was still waiting for someone to notice she was even in the room. That semester in university stretched on with a suffocating stillness, each day mirroring the last like a house full of identical mirrors, each one reflecting the same truth Grace didn't want to see. June was thriving. Not because she was trying to, never because she was trying, but because she simply existed in a way people found irresistible. She joined the Literature Society after a quiet nudge from a classmate and, within weeks, was asked to co-host a campus poetry night. Grace had considered auditioning herself. She'd written 3 drafts of a spoken-word piece about self-worth and identity, but the thought of standing next to June under soft stage lights filled her with an unnameable dread. Instead, she stayed seated during the event, clapping politely as June read a short poem about silence and snowfall. The crowd was transfixed, hanging on her every word like laundry on a windless line. Grace knew in that moment she could have screamed fire in the room and no one would have noticed. Later that night, June had hugged her and said, "You should have read something. You write beautifully." The compliment stung more than any insult might have, because June meant it, and that made it worse. There was no malice in her, no vanity or pride. June was unaware of her own gravity, and that made her even more unbearable. Grace started pulling away, just slightly. She declined 2 movie nights in a row. She started sitting beside other girls in class. She laughed louder when June was silent, and quieter when June laughed. These weren't decisions made aloud. They were instinctive, the way animals know to retreat from rising waters. Something unspoken was shifting, and neither of them wanted to name it yet. The final crack came like a whisper, not a scream. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that passes without incident in most lives. June and Grace were walking home from the local bookstore, their paper bags rustling with stories yet to be read. They passed a group of boys from the engineering faculty, one of whom had once flirted half-heartedly with Grace in a tutorial. But now his gaze landed squarely on June. "Hey," he said, smiling in a way Grace had memorized. June, caught off guard, offered a small wave, her eyes flickering downward in embarrassment. The boy nudged his friend, and whispered something that made them both chuckle. Grace caught the words. "She doesn't even try, and she looks like that." It wasn't the sentence that did it. It was the way it mirrored her own thoughts. Thoughts she had kept locked away, buried beneath jokes and eyeliner and breathless attempts to matter. That night, as June brushed her hair by the window, humming a tune from the radio, Grace watched her with an intensity that scared even herself. There was a rhythm to June's movements, an ease that felt earned by another lifetime. And in Grace's chest, something turned cold. She couldn't sleep. She lay awake long after June's breathing evened out, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts pacing like a caged animal. There was no plan, no evil spark of genius, only a slow, rolling cloud of desperation. Her mind, once her refuge, became a hall of voices. They all asked the same thing: what if she lost it? Not her smile, not her voice, but the thing that floated behind her like a banner of effortless grace. The one thing everyone mentioned before her name: the hair. And so, like most things that are done out of quiet misery, the idea didn't arrive fully formed, it crawled. Over the next week, Grace began noticing things she had never paid attention to before. The way June never locked her door. The way she slept soundly, tucked on her side like a child safe from the world. The way her hair spread across the pillow like spilled oil, impossibly smooth. Grace imagined the sound scissors would make if they touched that silence. She imagined June's face in the mirror the next morning, surprised, vulnerable, human. She convinced herself it wasn't evil. It wasn't cruelty. It was a correction, a reset, a way to bring things back to neutral. The thought didn't disgust her, it thrilled her. She began carrying the thought like a stone in her pocket, turning it over, examining its edges, warming to it. It wasn't a decision made in one night. It was a conclusion reached slowly, a map drawn from bitterness, longing, and the ache of standing in someone else's shadow too long. And when June invited her over for a weekend stay, just like old times, sleepover and movies and snacks, they both walked into it with different hopes. June wanted to remember who they were before the silence crept in. And Grace? Grace brought scissors wrapped in a makeup pouch, the blades hidden beneath lip gloss and perfume. She didn't know yet whether she'd use them. She only knew she wanted the option. The power of could was enough, for now. The wind that night didn't howl, it murmured. A soft, uneven song brushing against the windows, like the breath of something uncertain. June's room smelled faintly of coconut oil and vanilla, the kind of scent that lingered like a lullaby. The ceiling fan spun lazily above them, its clicking rhythm slow enough to hypnotize. They'd spent the earlier hours the way old friends often do, surrounded by things they once loved, trying to recapture a warmth they no longer knew how to hold. Popcorn that went half-eaten. A movie they didn't finish. Quiet laughter that came too quickly, like an echo searching for its source. June, ever gentle, had suggested sleeping early. She had mentioned how tired she'd felt lately, though her eyes were clear and her smile hadn't lost its shine. Grace had nodded, agreeing with everything, speaking less and less as the night wore on. Her silence was not suspicion, and June, trusting by nature, didn't read into it. She didn't notice the way Grace's fingers lingered on the zipper of her bag, nor how her eyes kept drifting toward the dresser drawer, where the scissors now lay hidden beneath a scarf. As June drifted off to sleep, cocooned in the softness of her blanket, her breathing light and even, Grace lay beside her, eyes open in the dark, heart beating like a distant drum. Every time she closed her eyes, they flew open again. Not out of fear, but anticipation. The moment hadn't arrived yet, but it was near. Close enough to taste. Her thoughts spun like smoke, every rational excuse dissolving into a single poisonous thread. This was not wrong. This was overdue. For a long time, she didn't move. The weight of the idea still pressed on her chest, not yet unbearable, but undeniably present. A part of her had hoped June would stir in her sleep, roll over, or mumble something that would break the tension. That maybe, just maybe, the universe would stop her. But the night gave no signs. June lay still, her head slightly tilted toward the window, strands of her hair glistening under the moonlight. That hair, untouched, unspoiled, perfect in its defiance. It framed her face with an elegance that seemed almost staged, like something from a dream too polished to be real. Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. She could still back out. She could turn her head, close her eyes, and let the night carry her into sleep. But sleep had long abandoned her. She sat up slowly, each movement quiet, cautious, as if the air might betray her. Her feet touched the floor like whispers. She walked to the dresser, careful not to let it creak. The scissors were cold in her palm, heavier than she remembered, though they fit between her fingers like they belonged there. She returned to the bedside, standing above June now, not with malice, but with a curious detachment. Her heart was no longer loud. It had quieted, falling into the background, as if her body had taken control, moving on some terrible autopilot. June didn't stir. Grace knelt, bringing the scissors near the cascade of hair that flowed across the pillow like ink spilled in water. Her fingers slipped beneath the strands, lifting them gently, reverently even, like holding something sacred before its fall. The first cut was hesitant, a trembling slice through the middle of silence. The sound, crisp, definite, made her flinch, but June didn't move. Encouraged, or perhaps emboldened, she made another cut. Then another. Hair began to fall. Not wildly, not in chunks, but in soft layers like petals from a dying flower. It took longer than she expected. The scissors weren't sharp enough for precision. Some strands caught and frayed, forcing her to saw at them awkwardly. She worked carefully, quietly, inch by inch, clipping away the symbol she had come to resent. The floor began to disappear beneath shadows of black, curling softly as they landed. There was no joy in it, no victory, just focus. Grace's hands didn't tremble, but her eyes began to sting. Whether from guilt or dust, she didn't know. She kept going. She couldn't stop now. It was like watching a tower collapse in slow motion. Every piece that fell only reminded her that something irreversible was happening. As she reached the crown of June's head, she paused. There was still time to put the scissors down and whisper something, anything. Make it a joke, a prank, claim madness, plead apology. But the silence around her demanded finish. When she clipped the last long strand, it slipped from her hand like a sigh. The girl beneath her still slept, unaware that a part of her had been taken. Grace rose slowly, wiping her hands on her pajama pants, the scissors now warm from her grip. She placed them back in her bag, tucked beneath a compact mirror and an unused lip gloss. Her eyes didn't meet June again. She slid under the covers, facing the wall. Her heart had gone quiet. But in her stomach, something churned. Sleep didn't come easy, but it came eventually, shallow and restless. Outside, the wind changed direction, rustling the willow branches against the glass like a warning too late to matter. Morning entered the room with its usual calm. Soft light spilled through the curtains, coating the furniture in gold and dust. Birds chirped at a distance, their song lazy and unaware. It was June who stirred first. She stretched, yawned, rubbed the sleep from her eyes. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the warmth of the blanket and the quiet of the room. Then, as habit dictated, her hand reached up to push her hair back from her face. But there was nothing. Just air. Her fingers brushed against uneven patches, jagged, unfamiliar. Her brows furrowed. She sat up, her movements slow, confused, not yet alarmed. She touched her head again. Her breath caught. She looked down at the sheets, black strands scattered across them like pieces of a broken promise. Her body froze, mind racing to catch up with the truth her fingers had already found. She turned to the mirror on the wall, not rushing, but with a kind of dazed surrender. The reflection hit her like a wave of cold water. What she saw wasn't herself. It was a version of her that had been torn, reshaped, undone. Her hair, once her quiet armor, had been slashed in disarray. No symmetry, no mercy. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her chest rose and fell steadily. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Her eyes flicked to the bed. Grace lay still, her back turned, feigning sleep. And in that moment, June understood. She didn't need a confession. She didn't need to ask. Some betrayals announce themselves with such clarity that explanation becomes irrelevant. June sat back on the bed, her hands resting on her knees. The air felt heavier now, the silence too loud. And yet, she remained still. Only one word slipped from her lips, as soft as breath, but sharp enough to cut. Grace. Grace had never been a light sleeper, but that morning, her body betrayed her by waking earlier than expected. Her back still to June, eyes closed tightly, she kept her breath slow and steady, mimicking the rhythm of sleep. But the silence in the room felt different now. It didn't hum the way it had the night before. It pressed in from all corners, dense and watchful, like fog sitting too long over still water. She could feel the shift in the air, the kind of invisible disturbance that clings to you before a storm breaks. And though June hadn't said another word after that one sharp whisper of her name, Grace could feel her wakefulness, palpable and unmoving. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time blurred in that space where regret begins to bloom, but hasn't yet taken form. Grace wondered if June was staring at her, or if she had already turned away, perhaps looking out the window, or at the strands of her own hair strewn like evidence. Still, she didn't turn around. Facing June would mean confirming the weight of what had been done, and her heart wasn't ready to carry that yet. Instead, she stayed curled under the blanket, trying to disappear into the warmth. It was a poor shelter. Every breath she took tasted like copper and dust. She waited for June to cry, or to scream, or even demand why. But there was no outburst. Just that same, unbearable quiet, stretching longer than it had any right to. Sometimes, silence is not a void, it is a verdict. When Grace finally gathered the courage to rise, June was sitting at the edge of the bed, her back straight, posture still as a photograph. The blanket pooled around her waist, her hands resting gently on her thighs. There was no panic in her face, no trace of sleep, only a strange calmness that felt foreign to the room they had shared so many nights before. Her eyes didn't turn to Grace, not immediately, and her lips remained sealed as if words had become a currency she no longer trusted herself to spend. Grace sat up slowly, her breath catching in her throat, searching for something to say that wouldn't sound ridiculous or cruel. But what language exists for such a betrayal? Apologies, when placed too late, sound like insults. And lies, no matter how sweet, shrivel in the presence of truth. The truth sat between them now, loud and undeniable, like a third person watching them both. Finally, June stood. She walked across the room, barefoot and light, almost detached from her own body. She picked up a hairbrush and then stopped herself, staring down at it like it was something she no longer recognized. Then she turned to Grace, not in anger, not in sorrow, but with a steadiness that landed like thunder. "Did you think this would make me smaller?" she asked, her voice soft but firm, each word measured. Grace blinked, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, but the reply never came. "Or did you just want to see me broken?" June's eyes were not cruel, but they held no warmth. Grace, caught in the crosshairs of those words, found herself shrinking despite the stillness of her friend's tone. It wasn't the haircut that undid June. It was the betrayal that came wearing a familiar face. The rest of the morning moved in a haze. June didn't ask for explanations. She didn't demand reasons or confessions. She simply packed her overnight bag, slowly and methodically, folding each item as though restoring order to something invisible. Grace watched from the corner of the bed, her hands resting limply in her lap. Every now and then she opened her mouth to speak, but the words congealed on her tongue like wax. There was no suitable phrase, no right combination of syllables to undo what her hands had done. June finished dressing. She stood at the mirror for a long moment, staring at the rough edges left behind, the tufts that stuck out like uneven brushstrokes on a once delicate painting. Then, to Grace's surprise, she smiled, not brightly, not in triumph, but a small, unyielding curve that seemed to come from somewhere far away. "It's strange," June said, her eyes still locked on the mirror. "I thought I'd feel ugly. I thought I'd feel ruined." She paused, running a hand over the side of her head. "But I don't." She turned back toward Grace, who had gone still as stone. "You didn't take anything from me. You just showed me what I can survive." And with that, June slipped on her shoes, lifted her bag, and walked to the door. She paused only once, hand on the knob. "You know," she added, not turning back, "it's not the cutting that hurt. It's that you did it while I slept." Then she opened the door and walked out, her silhouette disappearing down the hallway like a shadow stepping into daylight. Grace didn't follow. The sound of the door clicking shut was soft, but its finality echoed through every corner of the room. She sat there for a long time, motionless, her thoughts turning inwards like a tide pulling away from the shore. The sun had climbed higher now, casting sharp lines of light across the floor, making the fallen hair glimmer in fractured strands. She bent slowly, picking up one piece, then another, until her hands were full of them, thin, weightless reminders of something she couldn't return. Her fingers trembled, and finally, without willing it, she let them fall. The pieces scattered again, never returning to the shape they once held. She stood at last, walking to the mirror, and stared at her own reflection. Her face looked the same, and yet it didn't. She touched her cheek, then her jaw, as if trying to locate something lost. There was no monster staring back at her, but neither was there a friend. Just a girl who had crossed a line so quietly that even she hadn't realized it until the silence on the other side answered her back. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. But she did feel it, slow and deep, a kind of grief without a name. And in that still room, filled with sunlight and silence and the memory of what had been done, Grace whispered something so faint even she could barely hear it. "I didn't know it would feel like this." The next morning began without ceremony. No storm. No drama. No explosion of chaos. Just the soft murmur of morning air slipping through half-closed blinds, and the metallic chirp of a bird nesting somewhere in the rafters. June's footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway outside her apartment, precise and unhurried, as if she were moving through the pages of a book she'd already read. She wasn't late for anything. There was no one waiting, no phone ringing, no stage set for confrontation. And yet, her body moved with quiet purpose. In her left hand, she carried a single canvas tote bag. It held little more than a compact wallet, her journal, a pair of earbuds, and the black baseball cap she hadn't worn in years. She didn't need much. Not today. When she passed the hallway mirror, she paused, not to adjust, not to admire, but to observe. The remnants of Grace's handiwork were still visible, though softened by time and a quick fix from a local barber who had done his best to neaten the rough, uneven ends. Her hair now sat just above her shoulders, sharp but not angry. It revealed more of her face, more of her neck, and something else she hadn't expected, a clarity. She stared at herself a moment longer. Not for vanity, but for inventory. There was no grief in her reflection, no longing for what had been cut. It was strange, she thought, how hair could feel like armor until it was gone. And then you realized the armor was never the protection. It was just something to hide behind. She turned away from the mirror and stepped outside, locking the door behind her with a quiet click that felt like punctuation. By the time she reached the street corner, the city had already begun to stir. Morning joggers passed in clusters, students with half-zipped bags darted across traffic lights, and vendors wheeled their carts to their usual posts, preparing for another day of selling mango slices, spiced corn, and coffee from dented thermoses. June walked slowly, not as someone uncertain, but as someone refusing to be rushed. The wind tugged gently at her shirt sleeves and lifted the ends of her newly trimmed hair, brushing it against her cheek. A few people glanced her way, most of them strangers, but their eyes didn't linger. Not because she had become invisible, but because she no longer shimmered in the way they expected. She wasn't hidden behind a curtain of hair anymore. She wasn't offering mystery. She was standing plainly in the sun, and that kind of truth unsettles people more than beauty ever could. She made her way to the old bookstore near the park, a place she'd often visited but never stayed in long. It smelled like paper and time, and the owner always greeted her with a nod and no unnecessary questions. She walked to the back, settled into the same chair she always passed by, and pulled her journal from her bag. No one noticed her, and for the first time in a long time, that anonymity didn't feel like punishment. It felt like relief. She opened the book to a blank page and began to write, not about grace or betrayal or hair, but about light. About how it finds you when you've stopped looking for it. Meanwhile, across town, Grace sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the pale line of sunlight slipping across the floor. Her fingers tapped an idle rhythm against her thigh, not in thought, but in nervous habit. She hadn't heard from June since she left. No messages. No missed calls. No posts. Nothing. Silence had always been a part of their friendship, but this one felt different. This silence wasn't shared. It was given. Imposed. She tried to distract herself. She cleaned her room, organized her makeup drawer by color and brand, even tried to repaint the chipped edges of her closet door. But nothing stuck. Every sound in the apartment felt too loud. Every glance in the mirror felt like accusation. The worst part wasn't what she had done. It was the fact that it had worked. June was changed. Different. And yet, somehow not less. Not broken. She had expected collapse. At least anger. Some form of reckoning. But June had given her no reaction to cling to. And so Grace sat in her own undoing, unraveling slowly under the weight of her success. She had stolen something, and yet felt robbed. She had cut down the one thing she believed gave June her power, only to discover that power had never lived in her hair. It had lived in her calm, in her ability to be unshaken. And now, Grace was left to face her reflection with nothing to justify the hollow that had taken root inside her. That afternoon, Grace walked the long way to campus. She didn't have a class. She didn't even have a destination. Her feet carried her without reason, and her thoughts followed like broken branches dragged through gravel. She passed by the art building where they had once spent an entire afternoon painting self-portraits as a joke. June's painting had been quiet, abstract, full of shapes and shadows that no one understood but her. Grace's had been all color, loud, obvious, and desperate to impress. She remembered how they laughed when they swapped canvases, pretending to be each other. That memory felt like a postcard from a place she could never return to. Eventually, Her steps led her past the coffee stand near the west courtyard, and for a split second, she hoped she might see June. But she didn't. Only strangers. She sat on a bench, her knees drawn close, and pulled out her phone, staring at their last text thread. It was days old now. The screen offered nothing. Just blankness. Grace typed a message. "I'm sorry, I really didn't know what I was doing, but didn't send it." She deleted it, typed it again, deleted it again. Words felt useless. She leaned back and let her eyes close against the sun, wondering if this was the beginning of something, or simply the end of what she had taken for granted. Sometimes you lose a person long before they leave. You just don't notice until they stop waiting to be found. Weeks passed like slow-turning pages in a book neither of them was ready to finish. June no longer walked the same paths she used to. There was nothing dramatic about the change. No declarations, no posted updates, no symbolic gestures, just the quiet retreat of someone choosing peace over proximity. She started walking the longer way to classes, down a side road with lavender shrubs that brushed against her calves and old bricks that caught the soles of her shoes. Her hair, now trimmed evenly into a short, deliberate bob, no longer whispered behind her when she walked. But in its absence, something else had begun to grow, a different kind of grace, not borrowed from beauty, but earned through becoming. People noticed her still, but their gaze had shifted. There was no longer the wide-eyed wonder about how she looked. Now, there was a silent curiosity about how she carried herself. It wasn't the kind of attention that flattered, it was the kind that respected. She spent more time alone, not because she was isolating, but because she had grown comfortable in her own silence. She read more. She journaled without filters. She learned the difference between healing and forgetting. And though her phone remained quiet where Grace's name once appeared daily, June never blocked her, never erased her photos, never lit the match of vengeance. There are betrayals too deep for revenge. And sometimes, the most powerful answer is simply to keep living well. Grace, on the other hand, found herself caught in a strange kind of limbo. She hadn't spoken to June since that morning. She hadn't dared. She ran into her once, accidentally, near the campus library. It was a brief encounter, no more than a few seconds. June had exited the building, holding a paperback in one hand, the sun catching the curve of her shoulder. Their eyes met. Grace opened her mouth. Nothing came out. June didn't look away, but she didn't stop either. There was no malice in her gaze, no trace of anger, just distance. It wasn't coldness. It was absence, like a door that had once been open, but now simply wasn't there anymore. That look stayed with Grace for days. It haunted her not because it was cruel, but because it was final. There was no invitation to speak, no crack to slip an apology through. She began to see the ruins of her actions not in grand gestures, but in the tiny silences where June used to be. At night, she'd scroll through old conversations, fingers hovering over the keyboard, heart racing with words she'd already rehearsed 100 times. But nothing she could say would uncut the hair, unmake the silence, undo the moment where she chose to wound instead of love. That understanding settled deep, like sediment in a still pond, turning everything beneath it heavy and murky. Grace had never felt so far from the girl she thought she was. And maybe that distance wasn't a punishment, it was a mirror. What no one ever told her was that guilt doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just becomes part of your breathing. It wraps itself around your mornings, your laughter, your most joyful moments. It whispers behind every smile, asking if you've earned it. Grace tried to rebuild herself in small ways. She stopped seeking attention in loud colors and louder company. She started walking alone, listening to music without lyrics, sitting in places where she wouldn't be seen. It wasn't shame that kept her still, it was reflection. The kind that doesn't beg for forgiveness but understands the weight of what cannot be fixed. She began volunteering at a quiet garden across town, pruning rose bushes and sweeping pathways, finding strange comfort in cleaning up messes that weren't hers. The physical work helped. It gave her hands something to do when her heart ached too loudly. The older woman who managed the place never asked why she showed up every Saturday. She simply nodded and handed her gloves. One morning, while planting marigold seedlings, Grace looked up at the sky and whispered June's name, not hoping she'd hear, but needing to say it out loud. The clouds didn't answer, but the moment felt necessary, like turning a page, even if you're not ready to read what comes next. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she had started planting things again, and sometimes that's enough. June never spoke about the haircut again. Not to her mother, not to her classmates, not even in her journal, where she poured the rest of her thoughts freely. The act had been personal, and so was the recovery. But what changed was subtle, visible only to those who paid attention. She started smiling with more restraint, not because she was bitter, but because she had learned the difference between politeness and openness. She still laughed, but no longer at every joke. She still showed up, but didn't always stay. She became selective in ways that felt empowering rather than cold. People who once took her warmth for granted began to notice the boundaries she now carried like quiet armor. Her world didn't shrink, it simply sharpened. And one afternoon, walking past the university's reflection pool, she caught sight of herself, not the version others saw, but the one she now recognized. Hair short, posture steady, eyes softer but clearer. It wasn't the girl Grace had known. It was someone who had chosen herself in the wake of being chosen against. She didn't smile at the reflection. She didn't need to. She just nodded slightly, then walked on, the wind catching the edge of her collar, the day ahead wide and waiting. Some endings do not come with doors slamming or voices raised. Sometimes they come with a quiet step forward and the soft, unwavering knowledge that you'll never be who you were, but you'll never need to be again. Sometimes, the people closest to us can wound us the deepest, not with fists, but with silent envy and quiet betrayal. But your worth is not tied to what someone takes from you. Beauty fades, things change, but character, strength, and peace, those grow when you're no longer afraid to lose what made others comfortable. Learn to protect your peace, forgive without reinviting, and keep walking forward even when others expect you to break. You are allowed to become new, without asking for permission. May your heart never be a home for bitterness. May your light confuse those who thought dimming you would silence your shine. May your peace be louder than your pain, and may every loss you faced open the door to something more beautiful. I pray you rise above betrayal without losing your kindness. May your scars speak of survival, not shame. And may every step you take lead you into rooms where loyalty lives and love stays. In strength, in grace, in peace, we say amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.